Well, hey, LCBC in Parker Hill, it's Valentine's season, and love truly is a wonderful and a powerful thing. And so today and for the next several weeks, we actually begin a new series of studies, and we're going to be talking about the power of love. And today, I actually want to tell you a story. It happens to be a love story. It's a love story that's taken straight out of the Bible, and it's a story of love at first sight. It's actually a great, great story. And our story actually begins with a man named Jacob who's traveling far from home, and he's been walking for days. And the reason Jacob has been walking for days is because he's hoping to find himself a wife. And it's midday. Jacob is hot and thirsty, and when he comes upon a well, and all around this well are flocks of sheep and goats, and they're just waiting to be watered, but there's a problem. The problem is there's this large stone covering the mouth of the well, and it's keeping all the sheep and all the goats from drinking water. And so Jacob kind of stands back, and he just takes the whole thing in. And there's the hot sun, and the thirsty sheep, the thirsty goats, the thirsty shepherds. And then all of a sudden, up walks this woman, the most beautiful woman Jacob has ever laid eyes on, and her name is Rachel. Rachel, the Bible said, had a beautiful figure and a lovely face and a sparkle in her eyes, and instantly Jacob was hooked. It was love at first sight. And so quickly Jacob steps up and he removes the stone that covered the mouth of the well, and it's kind of like this Hallmark movie moment, and Jacob is the hero, and it's beautiful. And Jacob steps up, he removes the stone that covered the well so that Rachel and all of her sheep could refresh themselves with a much-needed drink of water. And Jacob was totally smitten, and he's captivated by Rachel. Instantly, he was hooked. And Rachel must have seen something that she liked in Jacob as well, because she ends up inviting Jacob home to meet her husband. Now, Jacob was so smitten with Rachel that he does something crazy. It's absurd, really. And I want you to look at what Jacob said to Rachel's father. And you can read the whole story in the first book of the Bible, Genesis. It's first book of the Bible, chapter 29. But Jacob actually says this. It says, since Jacob was in love with Rachel, he told her father, I'll work for you for 7 years if you'll give me Rachel, your younger daughter, as my wife. And I look at that and I go, oh my goodness, what did he just say? Did he just promise that he would work 7 years for the right to marry Rachel? I mean, what was he thinking? And I know we do some crazy things when we first fall in love, but man, 7 years, this takes the cake. And so after my first date with Ruth, I was actually smitten with Ruth. And so I did something absurd, at least for me, as a college student. And it was something I'd never done before. And I called a florist, and I asked them to send Ruth flowers. And our first date happened to be just a few days before Valentine's Day. And so when they delivered the flowers for Ruth, they definitely had this strong Valentine's theme going, something that I hadn't been considering. And so later, Ruth actually invited me to her dorm room to see the flowers. And when I saw the flowers, I was surprised to see that the florist had actually put a big red heart right in the middle of the Ruth's flowers with the words, "Be mine," in big, bold letters. And I was shocked. I mean, I was totally embarrassed. And yeah, I was smitten with Ruth, but I was still playing it coy. I was being cool, and I wasn't ready yet to let on to Ruth how smitten I was. And add to that, my surprise was the fact that when I looked around Ruth's dorm room, I noticed there were 3 or 4 other bouquets of flowers from other guys that I assume were equally smitten with Ruth as well. Now, Jacob was smitten with Rachel, and he actually tells her dad, 7 years, I'll work for you for 7 years if you'll allow me to marry your daughter. And here was Rachel's dad's response. He said, agreed, Laban replied. That's Rachel's father. I'd rather give her to you than anyone else. Stay and work with me. And Jacob worked 7 years to pay for Rachel, but his love for her was so strong that it seemed to him to be a few days. And again, this is so beautiful. I mean, again, it almost brings tears to my eyes because he says, 7 years I'll work for you to win the right to marry your daughter. But to him, it's just like those 7 years were just like a few days. And you go, oh, what a beautiful thing. And now, as magical as this love story may appear, I do need to pause and tell you that relationships are complicated. Relationships are never easy, and we think that all we have to do is fall in love with the right person, and then we're going to live happily ever after. I mean, we think if we can fall in love with the right person, then we'll never have a spat. We think if we can truly be in love, we'll always be happy. There'll never be tension. There'll never be disputes. We'll always agree, and at the very least, if there are disputes, we think, man, we'll always know exactly how to settle that dispute quickly and peacefully. And I suppose if life were a Hallmark movie, I suppose that might be true. But after waiting 7 years for this marriage, we would kind of think that Rachel and Jacob's wedding, that it would actually go off without a hitch. But again, this isn't a Hallmark movie. And Rachel and Jacob's story, it's real life, and real life is complicated. And in real life, relationships are complicated. Now, before I tell you about their wedding, I just need to give you a little bit of the backstory. See, Jacob actually had an older brother. His name was Esau, and as the older brother, Esau was in line to inherit a double portion of their father's possessions. That is until one day, after a hunting trip, Esau was hungry. He came home and he was famished, and Jacob happened to be making stew, and Esau asked for some of the stew. And seeing his chance to get the upper hand over his older brother, Jacob said, you know what, I'll give you a portion of stew. If you give me a portion of Dad's inheritance, sure, I'd be happy to give you stew. And foolishly, Esau proceeded to give him a double portion of his inheritance, all for a bowl of stew. Not surprisingly, this little arrangement further complicated what was already a complicated relationship between these two brothers. And then you add to the fact that Jacob's mom and dad, they had their own issues as well. His dad actually loved Esau more, and Esau was a skilled hunter, a man of the open country, and his dad liked that. Jacob, on the other hand, was loved more by his mother because Jacob was a quiet man. He stayed close to home, and mom and dad's divided love added more complication to the lives of these two brothers. So there was bitterness. There was a hatred that actually existed between Jacob and his brother Esau. That hatred was so strong and it was so intense that Esau actually planned to kill his brother Jacob as soon as their father died. So out of fear, Jacob fled his home and traveled to a faraway land, which is where our story picks up, with Jacob finding himself at a well covered by a stone, surrounded by sheep and goats, when a beautiful woman named Rachel appears. So our story continues. 7 years, remember. Jacob had worked to earn the right to marry Rachel. The story says, finally the time came for him to marry her. I have fulfilled my agreement, Jacob said to Laban. Now give me my wife so I can sleep with her. Patiently, he's been waiting 7 long years to be with her. So the Bible says Laban invited everyone in the neighborhood and prepared a wedding feast. In other words, the whole town was invited. This is going to be the event of the year. But remember, life is complicated and relationships are complicated. And you would never guess what actually happens the night of the wedding. This is the way the story reads in Genesis chapter 29. It says, but that night, when it was dark, Laban took Leah to Jacob and he slept with her. Leah was Rachel's older sister. So when Jacob woke up in the morning, it was Leah. What have you done to me? Jacob raged at Laban. I worked 7 years for Rachel. Why have you tricked me? And a trick it was. And Laban goes on with some kind of lame story about it being the custom in their land never to allow the younger daughter to be married before her older sister. And very quickly we realize life is complicated and relationships are complicated. So Jacob is far from home because he's hated by his brother. He's married to a woman that he doesn't love. And if that's not enough to completely complicate things further, Laban adds to the whole mess. And he says this, he says, wait until the bridal week is over, then we'll give you Rachel too, provided you promise to work another 7 years for me. And again, Jacob is smitten, he agrees to do it. And the story says, a week after Jacob had married Leah, Laban gave him Rachel too. So Jacob slept with Rachel too, and he loved her much more than Leah. He then stayed and worked for Laban an additional 7 years. And again, I look at that and I go, oh my goodness. can you imagine what life was like in that tent? Can you imagine what life was like in that family, in that town? Rachel felt loved. Leah did not. Leah ends up having babies. Rachel did not. And not surprisingly, things weren't good between Jacob and his father-in-law, Laban. And you can imagine the jealousy, the comparisons, the hatred that existed in that family. And my guess is you know those feelings. It starts deep down in your gut somehow, and it moves across your entire body till the whole thing feels like you're on fire and you can hardly think straight. And it causes you to think things that you shouldn't be thinking, and it causes you to say things you wish you'd never said, and left unchecked, it causes you to do things that you regret having done, things that you can never undo. That's all because life is complicated and relationships are complicated. So 20 years later, Jacob decides it's time to go home. His family's grown exponentially. He now has great wealth. He's got large flocks of sheep and goats and donkeys and camels. But as he's heading home, he's also afraid. He's afraid of what lies ahead because, remember, he's going back to his brother Esau, who he had tricked, who he had deceived. It's the brother who just couldn't wait to kill him when their father died. And do you know what I've learned over the years? I've learned that we all have a story. Every single one of us have a story. And if I could sit down with you, after enough time and enough questions, your story, eventually it's going to come out. And you too have a story. And your story may not look exactly like Jacob's story, but I'll bet it's just as complicated because life is complicated. And relationships are complicated. So Jacob is on his way home, and he finds himself scared. And so you know what Jacob does? He does what so many of us do when we find ourselves and there's no place else to go, nowhere else to turn. Jacob finally cried out to God. Isn't it something how we tend to wait until there's nowhere else to go? I think I've got no other plan, no other hope. So often we finally turn to God as though he's our last resort. There's nothing else that I can do. So we turn to God, and that's what Jacob did. And Jacob said, "Oh Lord, you told me. Return to your land and to your relatives. And you promised me, I will treat you kindly." So Jacob said to God, "I'm not worthy of all of the unfailing love and faithfulness you've shown me. But, oh Lord, please rescue me from the hand of my brother Esau. I'm afraid he is coming to attack me, along with my wives and children." And you know what God did? God did what God always does. God hears Jacob's cry, and God did what God always does. God stepped into the mess, and he guided Jacob through the mess. He guided Jacob through the storm. And it's a fascinating story that reminds me that life is complicated, and relationships are complicated. And you can read the whole story on your own if you want. Book of Genesis, chapters 28 to about chapters 32 or so. And so let me tell you why I'm telling you this particular story. And let me tell you one of the reasons why this story is actually in the Bible. You see, partly it's to remind us that life is complicated, that relationships are complicated, and deception and comparisons and jealousy and hatred still happen today because that's kind of what people do. We complicate life and we complicate relationships. But more importantly, more than just reminding us how complicated life is, the story is actually about God. And this story is in the Bible to remind us of who God is, and that in the midst of all of the complications of life, in the midst of all the complications in our relationships, God does not change. And God can be trusted. And see, you do realize that God wants you to do life well. God doesn't want you to experience avoidable heartbreak and regret in your relationships. And I would imagine that God actually tires watching people make something that's already complicated all that much more complicated. And let's be honest, life is hard enough as it is, and there's already enough unavoidable pain that, man, why in the world do we need to complicate it? Why in the world do we need to add pain because of our own foolish decisions? And so I want to give you just a couple of lessons from this story that actually can help us avoid more heartbreak, more pain, and more regret in our relationships. And these lessons are just as relevant today as they were 4,000 years ago in Jacob's complicated life. Because remember, the real point of the story is that God does not change. So number one, and you may want to write these lessons down. In the midst of your mess, seek God first. In the midst of your pain, look to God first. When life gets overly complicated, look to God first. Jesus actually said it this way. Jesus said, seek the kingdom of God above all else and live righteously, and He, God, will give you everything that you need. I know we looked at that verse, these words from Jesus last week. And we looked at them in the context of Jesus saying God's going to supply all that we need financially, all that we need physically to get by. But these words from Jesus, they go way beyond finances. And they go way beyond our physical needs. They actually apply to worry. They apply to anxiety, to temptation, to broken relationships. And what Jesus' promise means is that God will help us find the right words to speak when we find ourselves in a complicated relationship and we are at a loss for words. Jesus' promise means that God will give us the courage to stand up and step back when we're being abused in a complicated relationship. And Jesus' promise means that God will guide us on our way back home when we're not even sure what's waiting for us when we arrive back home. And Jesus is promising that when we seek God first, God will give us exactly what we need in that moment. And what Jesus is saying is we can trust God. So Jesus says, seek after Him first. In other words, put the same amount of effort into finding God that you would put into if you were to lose let's say, your car keys. And you're going to open every cabinet, and you're going to open every door and under every piece of furniture, and you're not going to stop looking until you find them. And Jesus says, seek God first above all else, and He'll give you everything that you need. So I've got to ask you, how hard are you seeking God? I mean, to what extent are you going to find God? And to what length will you go in order to seek God? And how much effort with God? And here's why it's worth all the effort, because everyone wins when you seek God first. Everyone wins when you put God first. And think about it. Had Jacob sought God first, I don't think he would have ever tricked his brother. I don't think his mom and dad would have ever divided their love between their sons. I don't think he would have ever had to run away. I don't think he would have ever had to be tricked by his father-in-law. I don't think he ever would have ended up with two wives. I don't think he would have ever had to worry about going back home to face his brother Esau. But because Jacob did not seek God first, life kind of got way more complicated for him. And because Jacob didn't seek God first, his relationships got way more complicated with more pain and more heartache than he needed to experience, all because he didn't seek God first. And here's my guess. I think there's a real good chance that your life has gotten way more complicated as well, because you may not have been seeking God. You've been going your own way, and all of a sudden life's gotten rough, and as a result, every relationship in your life, it's gotten way more complicated, and you're experiencing way more pain and way more heartache and way more than you ever needed to experience. And you see, everyone wins when you seek God first. And let me give you a couple reasons why. I mean, first of all, everyone wins when you seek God first because God knows the way, and He promises to guide our steps. One of my favorite actually comes from the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah promised that when we're at a loss as to which way we should go in life, or with our jobs, or in our homes, or in our relationships, Isaiah says God will show us the way. And that's why Isaiah said this in Isaiah chapter 30, verse 21. He said, your own ears will hear Him. Right behind you, a voice will say, this is the way that you should go, whether to the right or to the left. And I love that imagery where it's just like God is right behind us, following us, and saying, hey, to the right, to the left, this is the way that you should go. And see, everybody wins when you seek God first, because God knows the way. Secondly, everyone wins when you seek God first because God is all that you actually need. Jesus said, seek God, and He'll give you everything that you actually need, which includes all things. It includes peace of mind. It includes comfort in times of sorrow. It includes purpose when you're floundering. It gives value when you feel like you have no self-worth and when you've lost all self-esteem and self-confidence. And no other person can do that for you. Only God. Seeking and finding the right person to love in your life, that's not going to be enough. No person will ever be enough. Only God. And so that's why Jesus says, seek God first. Finally, everyone wins when you put God first because God will never reject you. I mean, others will turn away from you. Others will turn their back on you. Others will actually be hurt by things that you say or do. Others will not be able to handle your mistakes or your bad decisions or your hurtful words or your anger or your lies or your failure or your addictions or your jealousies or all of your little quirks and idiosyncrasies. Others are going to turn their back on you, but God will never reject you. God puts up with you. And he forgives you and he accepts you just as the way you are, but he loves you too much to actually let you stay just the way you are. So LCBC and Parker Hill, can I just say, however complicated your life has become, however complicated your relationships may be encouraged today because this is what God says to you. He says, don't be afraid, for I am with you. Don't be discouraged, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will hold you up with my victorious right hand. So I actually want to tell you one more love story. This love story actually involves David and Blake. And David and Blake are part of LCBC. David and Blake know what it means to say that life is complicated. And they know firsthand that relationships are complicated. And yet David and Blake, they also know what it means to seek God first. And so I want you to listen to David and Blake's story.
My name is David.
And I'm Blake. So I'm from little, small, middle of nowhere farm country, North Carolina, going to a small church called the Upper Room Assembly, and David came to intern for the youth pastor.
I flew to U.S. with expectation of big church, big city. You end up with little Gates County, middle of nowhere.
I used to babysit across the street from our house. Our pastor had 6 kids, and so this guy rode his bike, what was it, how many miles?
I don't know, 5-6 miles. Nothing for a European.
So he rode his bike all the way from where he was staying to come help me babysit.
Never dated anybody. How do I say that I might have some feelings? What do we do? God put in my heart that if she is willing and she wants to be baptized, she's serious with me, and you're okay to, ask her.
So he ended up baptizing me in the river in North Carolina.
It was a little bit before I have to go back to check.
David actually Skyped with my parents to ask their permission if he could marry me. Says that he loves me, wants to marry me, whatever. My dad gets up and walks away.
I haven't heard nothing for a week, and then her mom says, yes, it's okay. We talked about it. But yeah, I think your dad was shocked.
He was shocked, yeah. He liked David, but he didn't get to know him very well in that it was just 1 year dating overseas until we got married. We moved to Czech, and I had never been away from home other than the one time. This was a whole new world, I was diagnosed when I was 17 with ankylosing spondylitis, which is a form of arthritis. Ended up not being able to get the medication that I needed, so we ended up just having to fly back to the States and live here.
We had our first Aneshka.
After we had our daughter, we decided we wanted another one. So I think that Aneshka was 4 months old when I got pregnant with their son, so they're very close in age.
And then my sister's boss was doing business with the guy from Potsdam to the town where I am from. Little tiny town in Czech Republic, or the northeast town of Czech Republic.
What are the odds?
Maybe 2-3 big factories there, and one of them happens to be, this guy from Potsdam owns it and needs some engineer who speaks English and Czech.
I mean, we certainly felt like this was meant to be from the beginning, for the job to work out so perfectly, for him to be able to fly home and see his family. Everything just felt meant to be. We felt like we were where we were supposed to be, like it was going well. So we moved up here. And it turns out in the job was gonna require him to travel more often than he was home.
The first year, I think I ended up being in Czech like 6 or 7 times. And one of those times was like for 3 weeks. And other jobs required me to travel to Massachusetts and Salt Lake City. So I was out a lot.
We hadn't been married for very long. I think this was maybe 3 years with 2 small kids, and he was gone all the time. And it was just me. So it took a while for me to get to the point of even having a conversation at this point. I guess I was pulling away more and more, going to my parents' house, pulling away from God, just being angry. And at that time, I feel like he was really leaning in. He was leaning into me. He was leaning into God. He was trying any way that he could to find a way to save us. I just kind of told him, you're going to have to say no sometimes. This is where we're at, and I can't do it anymore.
Job is obviously important to be able to provide for the family, but if God told me that, this is your wife and this is your family, so I learned that, I have to advocate for my family in front of the boss. I knew that God meant, for us to be together, and if we gonna lean on Him, He will find a way for us to, get close again.
I feel like he was very committed to us, committed to our relationship, committed to me, and committed to God. And that's what got us through. I just feel like Pennsylvania is where we're supposed to be now. We got through one of the hardest years of our lives being married, and right now we live in a good place. We have beautiful friends. The kids are in school and they have friends, and it just feels like life is good. I feel like our marriage is strong now.
We followed what God had for us, and I knew that I was following God's desire for me by pursuing my wife and my kids.
So in the midst of your messes, in the midst of your complicated life, just know that God is there. But here's the thing about God. See, I like to describe God as a gentleman because he doesn't force himself on us. God allows us to seek him, and when we seek him and when we choose to follow him, everyone in our life wins. I mean, life just is better when we're following Jesus. And so let me just ask you, how is your life going? And how much better would it be if you'd actually choose to seek God first and then choose to follow him? And about 3,000 years ago, a man named David lived a very complicated life with lots and lots of complicated relationships. But when he turned to God and when he chose to follow God, his life changed. And so this is what David actually said was his experience when he would turn to God and allow God to lead him. David said, "The Lord is my shepherd. I have all that I need. He lets me rest in green meadows. He leads me beside peaceful streams. He renews my strength. He guides me along right paths, bringing me honor to his name. Even when I walk through the darkest valley, I will not be afraid, for you are close beside me. Your rod and your staff, they protect and comfort me. You prepare a feast for me in the presence of my enemies. You honor me by anointing my head with oil. My cup overflows with blessings. Surely your goodness and unfailing love will pursue all the days of my life, and I will live in the house of the Lord forever." So LCBC and Parker Hill, as each of us choose to seek God first in the midst of just our very complicated lives and our very complicated relationships, I think over the next few days and weeks and months, we're actually going to be seeing some exciting things as we watch and see how God leads each of us individually, all because we've chosen to seek him first in all of our relationships. And I can't wait to hear your stories of how scared you were when you decided to step out and seek God first in your relationships, and then to hear about how God showed up and how he guided you and he protected you and he gave you everything that you needed. And I can't wait to hear your story of how your life has been changed by Jesus Christ. If you'd like to talk or pray with somebody about this or really about anything that you might be struggling with today, right now the chat on the screen will remain open for the next 10 minutes or so. And so stick around, let us know how we can pray for you. Or you can go to the LCBC website at any time and click on the prayer button and let us know how we can be praying for you. Or if you happen to be in one of our LCBC locations, there are people down in front on the left corner of each of our auditoriums. And when we're finished, come down. They would love to pray and talk with you. And next week, we'll begin to unpack some of our most complicated relationships. And so whether you're LCBC or Parker Hill, be sure to invite somebody to join us next week as we continue in our series, It's Complicated. And you can either send somebody a link to one of our gatherings so that they can join us online, or why not invite them to meet you and attend in person. Either way, you won't regret that you did. LCBC and Parker Hill, may the Lord bless and protect you. May the Lord smile on you. May be gracious to you. May the Lord show you his favor and give you his peace. Thanks for being here. We'll see you next week.